Morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the AphA Conference. I must admit, hosting an event in a virtual space, this is the second year we've done this, but it does always present some interesting challenges for the organising folk. So chapeau to everybody who's been involved in all of that, because again, I think it's an excellent event, and it's something which I know we all look forward to so much each year. So so well done for putting together an agenda which, it struck me when I first looked at it, was the range and the diversity of the subject matter we were covering over the 2 days of the event. It would have been really easy in a world and a year dominated by COVID to have had an event which was just about COVID, and it's really nice to see that there's something here for everybody in terms of all of that, and the vast array of activities that the analytical community quite rightly get involved in. So it's nice to see that reflected in the agenda. It's not just, there's something here for the uber techies, there's something here for people who are kind of more interested in the softer stuff. So I think it's a real good agenda. So well done to everybody for that. Also, it's been a year in which we've seen a significant development on a range of issues that are very close to my heart and very close to the AphA board as well. So at long last, long overdue by many years, we've seen the appointment of a Chief Data and Analytics Officer. At the moment, that's just for NHS EI, but I'm hoping that Ming Tang, when she speaks to the conference later, will give us an outline of what she's trying to achieve in that role. I'm sure she'll touch on some of the things which we're interested in, particularly around professionalism. It'll be really interesting to hear what she's got to say. But for people who know me, have known that I've banged on about this appointment for a long time, so it's really heartening to see that happen. We've seen the acceleration of all of the work on professionalism, and I know that various folk around the organisation, Emma and Gary and others, have driven that agenda forward, as well as being supported.
Paul, you've mysteriously gone on mute.
I need to.
Oh,
we probably missed a sentence.
Is that better?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. I hate Teams, by the way. I absolutely bloody hate it. Anyway, so I was talking about professionalism and professional registration and the work that's going on that, and obviously would encourage everybody to be proactive and get involved in doing that. I know that they've landed all of the work around leading practitioner stuff now, and there's the work's been ongoing around associate practitioner at the other end, and we've been working hard with them around student membership as well. So there's a lot of work going on that. The discovery work around the competency framework has happened this year. I know that Ronnie and Sarah Colking spoke about that yesterday, and that generated quite a lot of interest and discussion. So that report, I think, is available on the AphA Hub section of the website. So if you're interested in that, either pick up the phone or email Ronnie, and he'll answer all of your questions, or go and have a read of the report yourself, which is beautifully written, but I must say. And also, we're at the point of launching the AphA mentorship program. Again, something which we've been talking about and has been on the cards for quite a number of years now, and that's coming to fruition. So there will be an infrastructure around supporting analysts who want to get involved in either being mentors or being mentored, in terms of whatever it is that you want to get involved in, but primarily I should think around career development and assisting people to progress. So that's really exciting, and I look forward to all of that. And later on this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about some of the other initiatives that we've been doing aimed at supporting the community to sort of help themselves in a way around particularly sharing work that they're doing and breaking down some of those silos. There's fantastic work which happens around all sorts of organisations, but we very rarely get to see it. And so we're working hard around encouraging people to be much more sharing and less shy about some of the good work that happens in that. So I've got a couple of housekeeping things that Ronnie's asked me to touch on. So the links for the breakout rooms for this afternoon will be posted in the chat area on there should you need them. And when you're in them, if you've got any questions, please could you post them into the chat area or use the raise your hand function button at the bottom on Teams to let people know that you have something to say. And as always, you know, these things are so much better if they're participatory and you get involved, and it's not just people like me talking at a screen, which is, you know, pretty dull. So I hope that there's enough for today to well, obviously it's whetted your appetite because you're here, but I hope you enjoy the day and the conference is as successful as it was yesterday. I think Ronnie said there were over 100 people at various points during the day attending, which is great. I mean, it's really, really heartening to see that. And enjoy the conference. And for those of you who want to hear about what I'm talking about, I'll talk to you later on around about 2 o'clock. And have a good day. And I'll hand you back to Kate or Ronnie, whoever it is.
Thank you, Paul. Hi everyone, good to see you back again. I hope you had a really fantastic day yesterday, and as Paul said, we've got a really good packed agenda coming up for you with lots of interesting stuff, so do enjoy yourselves. I'm delighted to invite our first speaker of the day, Shaid Hussain. He's the Senior Information Governance Policy Manager from NHSX, and Shaid will talk to us about information governance. Shaid, welcome. Please come in.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'll just bring up my shared screen and my slides. Yeah. Are those slides visible?
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Brilliant, excellent. So first of all, thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I'll make sure whoever put me first on this agenda is kindly repaid. So my name is Shaid Hussain. I'm a Senior Data Protection and Privacy Manager as part of NHSX, and I'm here to kind of give you a talk about data protection, compliance, and what you need to do in terms of data analysts and when you are processing data. So what's our mission? Our mission really is essentially to change the perception of IG from bad guy to good guy. Sometimes people often think that IG is the barrier and it stops people from doing what they want to do. But ultimately, it's not a barrier. It's there to help you to find a mechanism, enable you to process data, but also share data. So we want to help you support in terms of simplifying IG, but also kind of providing ongoing support and being that kind of first stop person in terms of being there for you at the first point when you kind of process data. Ultimately, where do we start with data? Ultimately, the most important point to start when you as data analyst is to outline your purpose. Purpose is crucially important because you need to set out your purpose to understand what is it you're doing. So always make sure you set it out in a clear and easy way. Set out what is it that you're looking to do. You know, what are your intentions of that, what you want to process, because purpose is key and it's important to nail, because purpose is going to allow you to understand what data you need, where you need to get that data from, on what state you need the data in. It's going to help you understand what level of data you need, whether it's going to be personal data or anonymized data, and each will have its different requirements. If it's personal data, then you need to go down GDPR requirements and ensuring that you comply with the legislation. Alternatively, anonymized data, ultimately, if it's truly anonymized, then you're not going to have the GDPR constraints. So ultimately, make sure you're clear about your purposes from the start, because that will nicely bridge into the rest of the work of compliance, of transparency and accountability. So be clear and open about the reasons you're obtaining the data and what you intend to do with it, because it's going to allow individuals to understand how the data is being used and help them make decisions if they're happy to share the data. So sometimes we'll get asked, can we use data for other purposes once the purpose has been specified? Now, GDPR doesn't really ban this altogether, but there are restrictions. So if your purposes change over time and you want to use data for a new purpose, You can only do this with the new purpose if it's compatible with the original purpose. So if your scope, your purpose, and what you're intending to do doesn't change, then that should be fine. But it's important that you refresh your consent mechanisms and you update your privacy information so that individuals know what you're doing with the information and they're up to date in terms of how your processes have changed. So what GDPR essentially does make an important sense is about being open and honest. So, explain to the individuals what you're doing with the data, why you need it, and with whom you could be share that data. So if you ever feel as though you're struggling to kind of outline your purpose, always feel free to seek advice from your practitioners and your local IG leads. And even if you still have doubts, feel free to reach out to the ICO. There's no one better than speaking and reaching out to the regulator, because ultimately they're the ones that come and mark your homework. And if you've got assurances about your mechanisms are working from the ICO, then that's going to put you in good place. So as I mentioned, purpose is where you build your product, and it's important because it's going to allow you to understand the level of data you're going to need, whether it's going to be personal data or anonymized data. So obviously in analytics, there'll be different types of services you use, whether it's commissioning or case finding. With commissioning, it's going to be more about services. So always ask yourself, can I start off with anonymized data? Will it allow me to achieve the outcome on the objective that I want to do with the services that we want to bring in? If it doesn't, then add another layer of data and see whether you can go a bit beyond anonymous data to achieve what you can, but clearly articulate that in your documentation as to why you've had to go beyond anonymous data to go and reach the objective that you wanted. And ask yourself the question, if you are working with anonymous data, is it truly anonymous? Have I carried out checks and kind of documentations to see whether any data could be potentially identified, or is there any risk of an individual being identified from that particular data? If it is, then treat that as personal identifiable data. And the benefits are there to see. You're not constrained by GDPR. It limits your risk, and there's no kind of there's no need for user consent, and there's no particular protection requirements. But on the other hand, you'll have personal data, and that'll be more relevant for case finding, where you're looking for particular interventions for specific people with particular illnesses. And the example I'd give is the study in Bournemouth, where people with type 2 diabetes also had health conditions, which made it difficult for them to manage their diabetes. So these individuals were identified as those at risk and provided with care plans and helped to kind of manage their diabetes and health itself. So there's clear benefits, and that's what you need to do in your purpose document, as well as kind of justifying why you need that data. Outline the benefits in terms of whether it's going to be early intervention, targeted support, and also kind of future support by identifying these particular risk individuals. We're not only providing good healthcare for these individuals, but we can also then target it the next future of people that we may see with the same kind of particular issues. But it's important, if you are using personal and confidential data, ask yourself and check whether confidential patient data is actually needed. If it is, justify your reasons and document it, and make sure, if it's needed, that you're clear with the explicit consent. If not, if you can't get anonymized and explicit consent, then go for Section 251 support, which will allow you to for the duty of confidentiality to be lifted for a temporary period of time. So consider your data, where it's coming from, what data you need, and the intended outcomes. This is always going to allow you to kind of build your trust, your kind of transparency, and also accountability. So by kind of taking that approach, by building your purpose and kind of being clear and transparent from the start, it's going to allow you to kind of pose the question of proportionality and transparency. So proportionality is important because you're required to process data which is kind of adequate and relevant. So, you need to justify and set out why you need the level of data that you're looking for and what are the outcomes. Explain why you need that data. For example, if I was looking for data on school children and respiratory issues and see if I can make a link and improve particular health for those individuals, it'd be considered excessive if I went and got data on children that didn't have respiratory issues. So keep it to what's relevant and necessary, and only use what the data that you need. Otherwise, you'll be in breach of your data minimization and lawful basis of processing. So that ties in kind of nicely with data minimization. So whenever as data analysts you are using data, make sure it's collected for a minimum amount, collected on a minimum amount basis. Make sure you don't use data more than what you need. And if you do need data on particular individuals, make sure you collect on those individuals, and make sure you're not collecting excessive data. If you are, just make sure you carry out checks. And as I gave the example there, if you're running process of identifiable health data on 1,000 people, and you're only going to identify the top 50 people at risk of diabetes, you need to weigh that up against whether it's excessive and whether it's very relevant, and whether you can justify the reasoning behind why you need that level of data. So transparency as analysts, it's critical, it's vital. You need to explain to your patients and individuals what is it you're doing and why you're doing it. Transparency is ultimately a fundamental principle to data protection legislation. It's going to help you facilitate individual rights, but also gives individual greater control. It's going to allow them to build trust, and also it's going to build confidence, whether with the regulator or the public or the partners that you decide to work with. So by to ensure you're going to meet transparency, ensure you've set out your privacy policies, which are clear and easy for people to understand. Provide tools like dashboards, which set out for people and allow people to understand how the data is being used, and make sure it's easy and accessible. By having purpose, it's going to allow you to build transparency. Transparency will then allow you ultimately to go and build ahead on your accountability and build your processes for the next set of mechanisms like data protection impact assessments. So as we mentioned, if we do go down the route of personal identifiable data, then there's a need to carry out a data protection impact assessment, which is a legal requirement under GDPR. And a data protection impact assessment ultimately is going to take into the account of any high risk that's going to lead to rights and freedoms of natural persons. So what counts as high risk? It could be evaluation scoring, automated profiling, dealing with vulnerable data subjects. Anything that's going to relate to someone being potentially identified is going to be treated as identifiable data, and anything that's going to have an effect on data subjects. So DPI is ultimately important, because once you've got your purpose, the next layer is your data protection impact assessment. If you've homed in and nailed down your purpose, your data protection will be relatively straightforward, and it's going to help you assess your benefits of information sharing between organizations and individuals, but also allow you to understand and balance against any risks to the individuals due to processing. And it's going to help you go ahead and have an appropriate legal basis and help you identify any risks or any negative effects, such as compliance to non-compliance with data protection. So by identifying non-compliance, you're also able to mitigate your risks. So, if you consider one of the risks is potential access by an individual of data on it may be deliberate or accidental, you would put mechanisms in place to have remote access by login, where people are already given authorization. Those are privy to the information and have a requirement and justified reason to be involved in that. Alternatively, if we do go back to anonymized data, although we say that data protection and GDPR doesn't apply, go through the data protection impact assessment screening questionnaires and have that as an audit compliance to say you've factored in the kind of screening questions from the data protection impact assessment, and yet we still believe our data is anonymous. And that will act as a good audit trail for information. So if the ICO come, you can show, yep, we have carried out our due diligence and checked our information is actually anonymous, and here you go, we've carried our checks, whether it be by a motivated intruder test, but also by our screening questionnaires. So moving forward, it's important that we adhere to the key principles when it comes to personal data. From Article 5, it's very important that the information is processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. By lawfully, we mean you have a legal basis under Articles 6 and 9, and Article 9 in particular if you're dealing with special category data. It's also important to be fair and transparent, because transparent is going to allow us to be open and honest. It's going to allow the individual to understand what data we're using, where we intend to use it, with whom we tend to use it, and what are going to be our outcomes and how it will help the particular individual. Be specified, explicit and legitimate. Be clear on why you're collecting the data. If you need data on diabetes patients and mental health patients, be open and honest, explain that to the individual, what you're looking to do, what is it, how you're going to use that data, and how long you'll be keeping that data for. Also, make sure it's adequate, relevant, and limited to what's necessary. Identify data, be clear on why you need it. Once again, justify the reasoning behind it. Also, don't sit back and think, I've got information that's relevant and limited to what I need. Carry out periodic checks. Just because you've picked up data for analysis today does not mean it'll be relevant and necessary for 12 months' time. So carry out your checks and your diligence to make sure your data is relevant and it's up to date. And ultimately, if it's no longer relevant, make sure you either anonymize or delete in accordance to your retention schedules. And ask yourself the question, does it help the processing, help you achieve your purpose? Make sure also your data is accurate and kept up to date. There's no clear definition in GDPR on accuracy, but inaccurate means anything that's incorrect or misleading to the matter of fact. So make sure you take steps to ensure that your data is accurate. If you do identify data that's inaccurate, rectify that immediately, but also keep a log of the steps you've taken to correct that data. Have a process in place to check the level of accuracy. Record your sources of data so you understand what data is reliable and kind of where it's coming from, and kind of making sure that it's come in a secure and safe manner. This is ultimately all going to help with kind of your accountability, but also transparency. Also, keep it in a form that's no longer than necessary. Having a policy setting out your retention, review once again your data periodically, and make sure if it's no longer necessary, either erase or anonymize when it's no longer needed. But just because you have a lawful basis doesn't mean you can keep the data as long as you want. You still need to. It's important and imperative that you keep to your retention periods. Ultimately, if you continue to keep the data longer than necessary, it'll be considered to be excessive and irrelevant. And once again, you could fall foul of the data minimization principle and also your lawful basis for processing. And finally, when it comes to your fair processing principles, make sure you have the appropriate level of security. Protect from accidental or deliberate information being compromised. Have security which is appropriate to the risk and also to the level of processing. Data analysis, the main option usually is consent. Make sure it's freely given and specific and informed by a statement that's kind of by a clear affirmative action and signifies agreement to the processing of personal data. Consent means really offering individuals real choice and control, and genuine consent should put the individual in charge. And ultimately, that's what's going to build your trust and reputation with the individuals, and when they place you in a place of trust for handling the data. But to demonstrate consent, make sure you use plain language. Don't bundle it up. Make sure it's freely given and that it's non-negotiable in terms. Be clear in terms of who the controllers are, because if an individual kind of reads your consent terms and he walks away with more questions than answers, then you're not really compliant from a GDPR perspective on being clear and transparent on your consent mechanisms. So it's important from the consent that when you do ask for an individual's consent, be clear with them, on the identity of the data controller. What are your processing purposes? What are the levels of data that you're using? Make sure they have a right to withdraw. Make sure that's clear and concise. Don't use pre-tick boxes. If you are looking to use consent, make sure you check it against your practices with existing consents. And if you update your processes in line with GDPR, make sure that consent is refreshed and you ensure compliance with GDPR. And ultimately, make sure it's easy to withdraw consent and keep evidence of your consent and keep it under review. Don't think I've got consent and that's it. We leave it there. Constantly keep it in review to ensure it's compliant with GDPR. And ultimately, if you can't offer genuine consent, then you have a problem that you shouldn't be able to rely on it. Consent is really about an individual having a free choice and being able to make that decision that they want to be involved part of the study on the program. So with consent really comes an individual's rights. A data subject's entitled to the confirmation of what personal data is being processed and how it's being processed. So be clear once again to the data subject about who you're processing that data with, what data you're providing, justify the reason to it, but also explain the benefits to your processing of that data. Make sure they feel at ease and comfortable knowing that they've got a free informed choice and they've also got control of their data, and explain to them where it's being processed. So if you're a data controller in the UK and the data is being processed in France or Germany, be very clear with them, the mechanisms of having what safeguards you've got placed in having that data processed in the country, and set out the legal rights in terms of if there need to be a legal remedy, in which country that legal remedy will take place in. Would it be Germany? Would it be in England? And finally, also if an individual comes and asks for the data, make sure you comply with the subject access request within a calendar month, and that there be no charge for the first copy. So our mapping and purpose exercise is important because ultimately it's going to help us identify what data we're using, but it's also going to allow us to understand what our data controller relationships are, who's a controller and who's a processor. So processing information is important, so the data flow map is going to allow us to understand those relationships. So set out your data flow map, and it's going to help you identify whether you're a controller, joint controller, or a processor. So the starting point for anyone is understanding your role in processing, in personal data. It's going to help you ensure compliance, but also fair treatment of individuals. And you have to understand is that your obligations will vary on whether you're a controller, joint controller, or a processor. And it's important to know that the ICO do have powers to impose sanctions. Individuals also have a right to compensation for damages. So it's important that once you have done your purpose limitation exercise, it's important that you define your roles, responsibilities in terms of who's a controller and a processor. And to start off with a data control, it's important to ask yourself the question, who defines the purposes, the scope and the processing. If you determine the process, the means of processing, then you will be a controller and you'll have an overall responsibility for compliance and accountability. So ask yourself the question, do we decide to collect the data and process that data? Did we decide the outcome, and did we decide the purpose of processing? And did we decide which organizations collect? If you're defining the nature, purpose and the scope and the contents of processing that data, then you'll be considered to be a data controller. Alternatively, there could be more than one data controller. If there's two or three controllers, there'll be a joint controller relationship. And a way to measure that is to look at whether you've got common objectives and the same purpose regarding the processing. Are we designing the process together? Are we defining our roles, obligations, and responsibilities? And do we have the same purpose? Are we using the same data on one database? And do we have a common information management process with another controller? If that is, then make sure you have a clearly defined joint controller relationship. Alternatively, you could be a processor, and as a processor, you'll be acting under the instructions of a controller, and you'll be processing the data under their instructions, and you'll be responding back to them. If you do act outside the instructions of a controller, then you'll be breaching your data protection principles and could be held liable and sanctioned by the ICO. So it's important, once we have identified the relationship between a controller and processor, that our GDPR commitments don't stop there. Define your relationships. If you're a controller, if you're more than one controller, set out your data sharing agreements. Explain the lawful basis of how you'll be sharing, the level of data you'll be using, what's your roles and responsibilities. But it's also important that you clearly define your relationship and who will take the lead, whether it be on a subject access request, or who will take the lead when it comes to reporting on a data protection breach within 72 hours. What you don't want is, if you've got ill-defined roles and responsibilities, if there's a data breach, is both controllers reporting to the ICO and there's inconsistencies in your level of reporting, and you've not really synchronized your fact finding and providing that report back to the ICO. So keep it simple, keep it clean, and keep it concise language. Also with where there's a data controller and a processor relationship, make sure you set out your obligations and instructions to the processor so that they understand what they're expected to do and how they're expected to comply with the processing, and explain to them the level of data you're using. Now, data sharing and processing agreements are not legally enforceable. They are a high level agreements, but you can also have them put into a contract. So if you want to make sure your agreements are legally binding, build your contracts up and build them into your written contracts and explain who, why, how long, and the legal basis for information sharing. So we know from GDPR it makes any controller involved in processing liable for damage, which infringes the regulation. But also a controller and a processor can be exempt from liability if they prove that they've in any way not responsible for any action arising out of damage. So what we've discussed, purpose, transparency, accountability, having your relationships defined by sharing agreements and processing agreements will help you mitigate that and also absolve you for any kind of responsibility where you feel it may have been the processor at fault. So these clearly defined relationships will help you when you come to answer the ICO and show that you took all the necessary steps to kind of protect yourselves. So therefore, I think it's really important when we touch upon purpose, transparency, accountability. It's equally important. The controllers shall be responsible and also demonstrate compliance. And you're responsible for compliance, and you need to demonstrate by having robust and strong data protection policies. Data protection designed by default. This is why purpose is very kind of relevant, because by taking to the purpose, it'll help you build all the mechanisms of kind of privacy by design by default. Have your clear information articulated in a clear, concise way. Have written contracts, set out your obligations and your instructions to those that are involved, the controllers, joint controllers, the processors. Have a good reporting data breaches process and implementing your security measures. Don't stop just because you built something. Make sure you review it. Carry out checks, whether it be at regular intervals of 6 months, 12 months. Don't hesitate in asking an external company coming in to carry out an audit and look at whether your systems have got any flaws which need improving, and keep a record of that, because it's going to demonstrate your compliance is ongoing. Compliance doesn't stop just because you've started. It evolves, it continues. And carry out data protection impact assessments. Once again, data protection impact doesn't just stop once you've just started and got your program going. It's a live document, so you may come across other risks or mitigations during the startup or development or ongoing of the program. Build that into your DPI, keep it evolving. Well, we've seen, if we don't get things right, then we know the infringements are much more greater under the Data Protection Act of 2018. Previously, the fine was up to £500,000 under the 1990 Act, but now under the 2018 Act, failure to comply with your principles of fair processing and breach of individual rights can lead to a fine of over 20 million euros or 4% of your annual turnover. But it doesn't stop there. The fine is one aspect of it, but you also have to weigh up that any breach is also going to lead to a loss of reputation and also damages. It'll become newsworthy, and dealing with such data is also going to capture the media's attention. So damaging can often be quite long lasting. So obviously, what's important is I want to talk through some of the cases that have been quite high profile in terms of data protection breaches, to give you a kind of understanding if things don't go right, what the ICO can do. So after the Data Protection Act of 2018, one of the first cases to come through was the British Airways case. Initially, they were fined 183 million, which was then lowered to 20 million, which is still a significant amount. And British Airways were kind of processing large amounts of personal data without adequate security measures, and therefore failed the data protection law. They happened to fall foul of a cyber attack, which they didn't detect for 2 months. And later, having investigated them, the ICO said that they should have identified these weaknesses of security and resolved these issues as soon as, and they should have resolved them as soon as possible. It ultimately led to over 400,000 customers having their names, cards, addresses, and details accessed. And the ICO are big on breaches where there's going to be anxiety and distress. So it's important for yourselves as data analysts to kind of review your systems. Be proactive. Don't just rely at implementation stage. Continuously check your security systems. Kind of, as I said, bring people in to check your systems, carry out checks yourself, and document those checks, because what you want to show is to the ICO that you've got a good audit trail, that you've been proactively looking at kind of ways and measures of improving your security. We also had the case from Marriott, who were downgraded to an 18.4 million fine, where they had a cyber attack attack and had information access for nearly 339 million customers whose VIP status, their addresses, also their passport numbers were accessed. Now, the breach itself happened in 2014 and was only detected in 2018. So the ICO kind of made findings that they didn't have the appropriate technical measures in place to prevent such attacks. And once again, hence why they came really hard. Security was kind of never really at the heart of their kind of data protection measures in terms of preventing these happen. And it was a significant failure on behalf of Marriott to have kind of not looked at their security and made sure it evolved as they moved on. So once again, it's important that these cases really stress out the importance of kind of maintaining and checking your security. But we also got another case was Google. And Google's quite important because they were fined by the French regulator of 50 million euros. And they were fined because there was a lack of transparency. They provided inadequate information on consent regarding personalized ad personalization. People weren't sufficiently informed how Google collected their data. So Google would provide the information, but you had to troll through that information, which often meant going through 6-7 pages to then give information. So that information was very much diluted, and individuals weren't really fully able to understand what consent they were giving, and it wasn't clear and specific. So it really goes back as a data analyst, make sure your consent is clear and it's easy to access and it's easy for an individual to understand. Don't make it where it's like in Google's instance where it was required. It took about 6-7 documents to understand what they're consenting for. And similarly, the Italian, where the telecoms company, they were making unsolicited calls. And once again, they were found that individuals hadn't consented to these calls and were fined 28 million euros. So the importance of kind of today's talk is really about being transparent. Be transparent about who your data controllers are, what data you're using, the purposes, the recipients, what is your objective, what is it you're trying to achieve. And make sure that information, whether it be, when it comes to consent and also the data you're using, it's clear, concise. People understand what they're consenting for, and it's easily accessible. They don't have to, in like Google's instant, go and hunt for the information that they're looking for, and they understand it within 2 steps or within 1 step what they are consenting for. And make sure information is clearly visible via your privacy notice websites, and carry a layered approach. Make sure it's easy and kind of it's consistent, it flows, and it's easy to and accessibly understood. So moving forward, what's important is you take responsibility and demonstrate you've taken those steps. Develop robust programs. Have reporting structures that are appropriate, and make sure your staff have a good understanding and awareness of data protection. If things do go wrong, you can mitigate loss by showing that you've actively considered risks and have put measures and safeguards in place, and ultimately keep records of what you do and why you do it. And that, therefore, if someone comes asking you, it's easy for you to explain in a transparent way, and can constantly review and update your systems. Don't stop just because you've started. Continuously review that documents as compliance is ongoing, and you need to demonstrate and make sure you meet accountability. So finally, as an IG team, we're here to help and support you. IG, don't be afraid of it. It isn't complicated. If you call us in and ask for support from the start, we can make sure things are done fairly and reasonably and proportionally. And addressing IG at the start is the best way of caution. And also come to us, find us. So I've left my email address here. If you do need to contact us, by all means, we'll be much more than happy to come and give you that support and help. Thank you very much.
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's absolutely brilliant. It's great to have some IG input. It affects all of us, and you've certainly helped shift our perceptions from Horns to Halo, as you were saying earlier. It's great to have some advice, some checklists there. Helps us get the balance right between risk and benefit, and helps us avoid fines and stay within the letter of the law, which is really important. So we have got some time for some questions and answers, if that's okay. I've already got a couple here. So Ruth from Imperial College. Ruth, do you want to put your question?
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Kate. Thank you. Thanks very much for that presentation. I always need a regular reminder on data protection because it is so important, and it is too easy just to push it to the back of your mind on a day-to-day basis. So thank you for that. I just wondered, given that analysts have access most analysts, that is, have access to thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of records on a daily basis. I just wondered whether you could signpost any more in-depth data protection training materials or courses. And the reason I'm asking is that we're all required to undertake the mandatory core skills data protection training on an annual basis, but it is really basic. And it's maximum half an hour, and you've got to take the test at the end to ensure that you've understood. But it doesn't really cover off those circumstances where you have databases and restricting access to data warehouses. So I just wondered if you were aware of any courses at all that you could let us know about.
Courses, I'm not particularly aware of. I need to look into that for you, Ruth, and I'm more than happy to revert back to you. But what we are doing at the moment is kind of simplifying our information governance and tailoring our advice on our kind of NHS portal website. And I could certainly look at maybe kind of speaking to our publication team or developing kind of specific IG guidance for data analysts. And I think that there's a gap for that. So I think that would be very useful as a starting point. And in terms of training courses, I'm more than happy to get back to you. I think that we've also already got different advices notes on our NHS portal website about consent, confidentiality, and also developing further guidance on in terms of use of artificial intelligence. But I think there's certainly a gap where for us to need to kind of further develop advice notes for data analysts, which will probably be very useful for you guys.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And my team can put me up against the wall and shoot me because I'm sure they don't want to do more data protection training, but I think it's probably wise given the risks associated with what we do, so I appreciate it.
Yeah,
sorry.
Data protection can't be ignored, and it's here to stay. And I think we've seen from some of the cases like Google, if things go wrong, they'll go horribly wrong. And this sort of information always kind of captures the media's attention, and people, when they read into it, there's that kind of scare and fear factor. So it's about balancing, what's our objective and what the benefits we're trying to get. And we always need to have, data protection at the heart of everything. And that's why we kind of encourage, get us involved at the start so we can help you build those IG blocks for you.
Kate, I had another question, but I don't want to be greedy, so
that's okay. That's okay, Ruth. Fill your boots.
Thank you. So I posted another question in the chat, which was about the national. It was on the consent issue and the national patient opt-out that we're all required to comply with by. I think it got put back to the 30th of September. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how organisations can ensure compliance, because I think there's going to be, it's definitely going to bring a burden on analytic departments to, need to check on a regular basis whether patients have opted out. I'm entirely supportive of the opt-out. I just wanted to say that it's just about how we can practically implement it and keep it as a reasonable burden.
Yeah, so I think with opt-outs, it's something that we're going to also have to build into our simplification of IG guidance. But I think it's a matter of kind of having a good reporting and information structure when it comes to individuals opting out, and kind of being proactive and managing it from a data analyst perspective, kind of being on top of that information. I think with COPI, the COPI notice at the moment is due to kind of be revisited and be understood. I think in the next month or two, we'll be understanding in terms of whether that gets extended, in terms of whether that gets narrowed down in its use. And that will kind of really give us an understanding as well, how we kind of move forward with COPI and opt-outs as well. So I think there's kind of more information to be really coming out from our teams regarding the opt-outs, and that's going to be determined by our COPI notice and how it kind of plays out as well.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, I guess when we're looking for best practice, we'll be heading to Imperial College at some point. So you're clearly very proactive with that. Jane, I know you had some questions.
I do, yeah, I'm greedy. I've got 2 questions as well. So I'm Jane Johnson. I'm head of PHM Analytics at Surrey Hartlands ICS. So IG affects me a lot in what we're trying to achieve. Nationally, there seems to be, although GDPR is what it is and IG rules are what they are, nationally there seems to be a a huge disparity between different organisations and what they're able to achieve with regards to PHM and, you know, data sharing, etc. And it's the individual IG, local IG, seem to interpret everything differently. I have at national events, they always say, is there anything we can help? This is NHSE. And we always say, can there be a central repository, something, standard DPIAs, DSAs, DARs, whatever, that say to everybody, if you want to do this, you can do this. So everybody can do the same thing because of this disparity. But it never happens. Are there any, you know, is there anything centrally? Are there any plans for anything centrally so everybody can achieve the same thing?
Well, I'm glad you've pointed that out, Gina. I think this will be an opportunity for us to reach out and start developing something centrally. So I'm happy to kind of, you know, take this offline and for us to be more proactively involved and kind of use this opportunity of today's kind of presentation to take those steps forward. We do have central data protection impact assessments and data sharing and privacy and also processing agreements, which I'm happy to share to kind of act as that step forward in terms of allowing people to have a centralized way of working. So I think it's a case of really kind of reaching out to one another and kind of building that block forward so that we can provide also a national message, but also make sure that the message is consistent and the ID advice is consistent and you know, and everyone's singing off the same hymn sheet.
That would be brilliant.
So
Great.
More than happy, Jane, if you drop me an email and we can take that conversation forward and get some of those documents that may be of use to you so that we can have that consistent approach.
Excellent. You'll be my new BFF. My second question, with PHM, as we move forward, I mean, there's a lot of work being done locally, you know, on direct patient care, etc. But as we move forward, we want to start looking at AI. We want to start identifying things. We know of problems of frailty and diabetes and reducing hospital admissions, etc. But going forward, if we want to start using, you know, smarter working, and we know there's an issue, but we don't always know what data we need. So it's very difficult. You know, you're saying identify the data items you need because you are trying to find a problem. But when we get really smart, trying to find the issues we don't know and identify characteristics, how do we get around that? Because we might want everything to run an AI program against to come up with the answer. So how do you get around that when you can't be very, very clear about what you need because you don't know what you need to get the answer that you don't know? Does that make sense?
It does,
trip, isn't it?
It certainly does. I think that the key thing is having a justification, justifying your ends and the means, saying I need this in order to get that, because without this piece of information, I don't necessarily know how I won't be able to achieve my objective. And when it comes to AI, you know, we're working quite progressively on AI. It's still a kind of an area of learning and understanding, and we're quite, you know, heavily engaging with the ICO and moving that forward. So this is another discussion, Jane, I can take, you know, forward with you, you know, once you contract. But yeah, the answer to your question is really justifying your means and your purposes and being able to clearly explain it, because ultimately that's what the ICO want to see, that you've mitigated and you've clearly articulated why you need the levels of information that you need.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. My questions are done.
Yeah, I think the case there is about being cautious and not reckless with the information, and kind of having those guards in place to make sure, you know, once you have identified the level of information through the exercise that you've done because you've needed a large amount of information, what is it that you're doing to safeguard the information that you no longer need? You know, are you holding that, except, you know, or are you going to delete the information that you no longer need or anonymize it?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have any further questions? I can't see any more hands up. Okay, well, some really good questions though. Oh, Mike.
Oh, hi.
Welcome.
Sorry, I've got a very quick question.
No, don't worry.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Hepburn. I'm new to the University of Southampton as the head of the Centre for Healthcare Analytics. Shaid, thanks ever so much. It was a great presentation. One question, are you aware of the Goldacre review and the ramifications of potential ramifications of it?
I have one of my colleagues who's actually looking into that, so it's something that I need to pick up on with him, because he's one of my colleagues has actually been looking into that himself. So I'm not particularly myself, but it's something my colleagues picked up.
Okay, I'll put the website in the chat. There's been commissioned by Matt Hancock. There's a review into how data is going to be shared, hopefully with academia. They are having a session for healthcare analysts, a specific session. So I'll put the website there, and I just think for this community it might be worth just engaging with this. It's a fairly high level review. I don't know much about it, and I was hoping maybe Shaid knew more than me, but I'll put the website on here, and people maybe want to take a look at it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Jane again? Was that an old hand?
No, new hand. Just following on from what Mike said about the Goldacre review, I was actually involved in the initial meetings and workshops on that review. There were earlier ones for analysts, and I would suggest if you do get an opportunity to go in and join, it's very cathartic if nothing else. But yeah, it's well worth it, because unless we start voicing, opinions and what our issues are, we're never going to move forward to getting them addressed.
No, you're absolutely right, Jane. Okay, guys. Well, some brilliant questions. Thank you so much. I think it would be great to engage with some of that training when it comes out, Shaid. And perhaps we can tempt you to some regional meetings, and maybe do a launch with the magazine and put some bits on the website as well, because clearly there's a need for it and there's great enthusiasm. And I look forward to seeing some more on the Goldacre review as well.
Right. No, thank you very much, and I think hopefully this is going to open us an opportunity to do more further work. And like as from Jane's point, let's centralize things and make things better, so that we have one way of working.
That'd be brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, virtual round of applause. Thanks, guys. We'll look forward to having you back again. Right, so on to one of my favourite bits, everybody's favourite bits. Everybody loves these. We've got some show and tell. And coming up from Imperial College is Laura, first of all. Laura, good morning, welcome.
Hi there. I will just bring up my slides, so if you bear with me a moment. Right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so you may guess from the NHS Rainbow that this is a COVID-related presentation. So it's really about how COVID has impacted the way we prioritise our surgical patients. So I work in BI under Ruth Holland at Imperial College, and I work in the team supporting the Surgery, Cancer and Cardiovascular division. So just a bit of background about the trust. We're a large acute trust in northwest London. We've got 5 main sites, and we have a very large number of critical care beds. So this next slide really gives a kind of overview of the level of activity we've been doing in relation to COVID during the first 12 months of the pandemic. So you can see we've had over 5,000 patients come in with COVID. And if I highlight here, during the kind of winter peak, on one day we had 492 COVID patients on one day. So you can imagine the impact that that's had on all of our other services. So, we've all seen the headlines about how waiting lists have grown during the pandemic due to our reduced theatre capacity. We've had staff redeployed to other areas, increased infection control protocols, theatre staff having to shield or self-isolate due to COVID. So this means that unlike in sort of normal times where we could say, okay, this patient is a routine patient or an urgent patient, look at their RTT waiting time and sort of prioritize them that way, that's no longer going to give us what we need to address such a huge backlog with such a limited capacity. So NHS England launched a programme to assign a clinical priority to patients who are waiting for surgery. And this was using guidance published by the Royal College of Surgeons, where they kind of listed every surgical procedure and said what time limit that surgery needs in order to prevent harm to the patient caused by waiting any longer. So where we had routine and urgent before, we've now got priorities of P1 to P4. So you can see P1 is, the real emergency procedures. P2 is people who could wait up to 4 weeks, but no longer. P3 is up to 12 weeks. And then P4s are those who could wait more than 12 weeks without risk of harm. So how are we going to start doing this within the trust? So first of all, clinical coding went through all of that guidance and mapped it against our own surgical procedures catalogue. NHS England were also clear that phase 1 was only for surgical procedures and not any diagnostics. So we had to liaise with the services just to check that, we were capturing all of the right procedures and we weren't going to be, sending out a lot of diagnostics for people to review and prioritise. ICT then built us a form which would include not just a priority, but a clinical harm rating ranging from no harm to severe harm, based on, if that procedure was delayed, what harm would come to the patient. And a matrix was put together by a group of clinicians saying, okay, what's the guidance procedure? What's the harm identified to the patient? And so that would come out with a final priority with that time limit for when we need to treat them. And the form that ICT put together also includes some additional useful information, for example, flags about whether they're a vulnerable patient. So maybe sort of an additional safety review would be required there. So that form was used to attach to existing patients who were already on their surgical waiting list. But ICT also developed a new form for any new surgical orders. So replacing the old fields with this new mandatory P1 to 4 rating. So that meant that all of our kind of existing patients could be reprioritized, and then any new patients would already go on with a P1 to 4 priority. And then if it was deemed that any of these patients moved into a different priority box, they'd complete that separate form. So then we end up with, a data set we can track changes in priority over time, and look at any additional information clinicians have put in for their reasoning for changing the priority. So after phase 1, a similar form for endoscopy procedures followed this. So, structured exactly the same now that we've been able to set this up for the initial surgical procedures. So all throughout this, we really had to engage with the clinicians, firstly, to look at, how this process was going to work for them, what's their workflow when they, log into the system on the front end. So we made sure that we didn't create something that, looked fine in terms of data flow, but was so complicated no one was ever going to do it, or, people would make mistakes doing it and so the data wouldn't be useful anyway. And it really required a lot of teamwork between different teams, clinical coding to do the initial mapping, ICT building the forms, training all of the clinicians and admin staff who were going to use this. The data warehouse team built new tables, new data sets for us to use in reporting, and then within my team building the reports themselves. And we really had to, keep in constant contact, looking at how this was working, where can we improve? Are we identifying any problems? For example, we found some users were, making their own shortcut workflows, which weren't the officially designed ones, which meant that some quirks were coming out in the data. So we had to sort of look at that and change the code used. So once we kind of got the data flows all set up, I built a dashboard in ClickSense. We put together some KPIs that you could drill down into by specialty and clinician, and also bring up patient level detail. And this meant that, you could look and say, oh, that service hasn't prioritized many of their patients. Is there a problem? Have they not had training? You could set them up with, some extra training sessions, or put them in touch with a super user to help them. Or is there a particular clinician, is it that there's an issue with their, their type of patients that they have? So again, we could easily get in touch with them. And we recently added some new KPIs. So first of all, we simply focused on, who's been prioritized, and if they're a P2, have they been booked? Because that's the 4-week cohort. So our really time critical patients we had to keep doing even throughout the COVID surges. And we added in some new actions. So for example, they might have been booked, but that booking date is too long according to their priority band, or are they overdue because, you know, once a patient's been prioritized, we can't just say, okay, they're a P2, they're all sorted, and leave them on the list without looking at them again, because actually if they you know, if their condition has deteriorated, they might need to be brought forward, or someone who, for example, started off as a P3 and is doing okay, they, you know, yeah, they might get worse and become a P2 and need to be brought in. So you can drill in there, so every clinician could, you know, filter to look at their own patients, bring up that patient list. It's got what action needs to be completed against them, and then, you know, they've got everything they need to go into the system and update them. And we were also able to add this clinical priority to all of our reports involving the inpatient waiting list or theatre cases. So, for example, we can now track a specific P2 waiting list, because obviously those will be prioritised over the less urgent patients when we're looking at our demand and capacity. And also, managing our theatre capacity, we can say, okay, you know, this is our P2 demand, so we need this much session time specifically for those P2 cases. So here are just a couple of screenshots from the dashboard. So because it is in ClickSense, I don't know if many of you use it, but it's really interactive. So you could, you know, click on any of these categories and it will bring you your breakdowns, your patient detail. You can drill in by specialty, by clinician. You can select just one priority group and see what the actions are there. And as well as these kind of overview sheets, we've had ones flagging potential data quality issues, you know, where one patient's got duplicate pathways so they can be cleaned up. We've got an RTT sheet so we can see how it relates to our RTT reporting and weights. So it's a kind of interactive, more sort of live way of reporting than just sending out a spreadsheet. And that updates every day and is reviewed weekly with the operational managers who then, you know, escalate any issues to their clinicians. So kind of phase one is now in our maintenance stage. Over 90% of our surgical patients have been prioritised. This meant that during the winter surge, when we were under really tight pressures, we were able to manage the theatre capacity really well and still did a lot of the time critical cases. You know, we compared it against how many we were doing last year, which was basically none during that first COVID surge. And then we looked at 2019 and actually we weren't far below what we were doing on P2s during 2019 at that time of year. We've got, you know, any patients requiring a safety review because they're at risk of harm or, you know, other operational or clinical actions, they're flagged, reviewed at least weekly, and they're all escalated as required. And this, as I said, feeds into other projects. You know, we can track P2 waiters separately. We were able to manage theatre capacity during the winter surge. And we're looking at this even more proactively now. So we can plan saying, okay, if we do have another COVID surge on the way, you know, we have a plan of all our theatre sessions saying, okay, these ones are for P2s only, so we'll have to keep them going. And, you know, these ones would be P3s and 4s, so they could be closed down if needed. So the next developments for our reporting is we're looking at patients who choose to defer their treatment. These are called P5s and P6s now, depending on whether it's cancelled for or deferred for COVID or non-COVID reasons. So we are reporting that on a separate system called Qubit, and we're looking at how we can then feed that data into the same reports. And the next phase of the national programme is prioritising diagnostics procedures. So now that we've kind of done all the initial work, starting with surgical procedures, a lot of the groundwork's been done, so we can, you know, sort of build on what we've done so far for diagnostics and bring that again into the same reports. So the reflections on the project are really that collaboration is, I think, the #1 key to success here, because, you know, there were so many different departments, different types of roles that we had to be in sort of a constant feedback loop with to make sure we weren't getting surprises along the way, or people, you know, not knowing that they were supposed to be reviewing all of these patients or not knowing how to. I think we were lucky in that the divisional director really championed this. You know, she really encouraged all of the clinicians to get involved and take it seriously. It wasn't just seen as some sort of box ticking admin task that we wanted to do. You know, she really pushed everyone to sort of, yeah, just enthusiastically embrace it rather than having to be dragged along by the heels. And I think the main challenge was just the speed of the timescales. I think the initial development by ICT was done so quickly, but it did mean that later down the line we were kind of finding a couple of quirks in how the data was flowing that we then had to fix and, you know, code around. And I think if we'd had more time, you know, we would have covered all of that in the earlier testing stages. But, you know, that's COVID life. Fast time scales are now just kind of bread and butter. Obviously, this also meant that the training had to be rolled out really quickly. So that was like another project in itself. And then the report building, again, we had so many different versions that normally we'd kind of, you know, get a group of users together, test it with them. But again, we just had to sort of keep developing at speed. So that was a kind of a whistle-stop tour, really, of the project.
Wow.
I will stop sharing my screen so I can see you all again.
Laura, thank you so much. Really resonates with me. I spend a lot of my time dealing with RTT, the recovery program and everything else. And you're right, it's all just been done so quickly. But wow, I'm really impressed with what you've done there. I shall certainly be probably coming to see you and Ruth to see what I can do to maybe sort of pinch some of what you've done there for Dorset. Great job, ladies. We've got a few questions here. We've got John Bevan's got some questions, and Heather as well. Sorry. So John, would you like to go first?
Yeah, of course. So I just put it in the chat there. So yeah, my name's Jonathan Bevan. I'm from Digital Health and Care Wales. We used to be the NHS Wales Informatics Service, if anyone recognises that name. We're working on a similar project for outpatient care as opposed to the surgical elements of it. And one thing that we're spearheading really at the moment is delivering as much information to individual clinicians as well as managers as possible. So I was just wondering how you guys deemed what was appropriate and what wasn't, considering that the amount of data you could literally throw at clinicians to make their individual decisions. And I suppose what level of access was in mind there from the beginning, I suppose, in terms of do individual surgeons get access to this, or is it literally ward managers and so forth that would be seeing this level of data?
So I think from the beginning, the divisional director was really keen that individual surgeons would get involved as well. It wasn't just something that they could, you know, delegate to the sort of manager or admin functions. So, you know, every individual surgeon can go into the dashboard, which updates every day. They can filter to themselves only, and then they've got all of the patient details that they need. So we didn't want to keep it as a kind of like a separate tool that would then get maybe, you know, God forbid someone would create their own spreadsheets from the dashboard and send it to their clinicians, because that's exactly what we hate. So we were very keen that it was just going to be one tool for all users. So, you know, surgeons will go in, but also the performance team, other analysts who are doing related reporting. You know, it's a kind of one-stop shop for all different user groups.
And that's key, isn't it? That being the one-stop shop for whatever it is they need, because, you know, God only knows we have so many different systems that contain so many different bits of information that people just get tired of it. So this tool that you guys have created, is it bolted onto anything else that's part of their day-to-day work stream, or is it something brand new that incorporated a lot more?
Well, we have been using ClickSense for quite some time, and so most users in the trust are pretty used to going into our ClickSense hub and accessing data that way. And then they have to go into the PAS. We use Cerner. I don't know which system you use, but we've had to provide, you know, the case number from Cerner so that they can instantly log in and bring up the right record. So while it is always going to be a separate reporting tool, we've tried to keep it as simple as possible.
Absolutely. We tend to use Power BI for our dashboarding needs, and we've also got our clinical portal, which is more of a patient-centric model. So our thoughts are to just basically develop it off that. They've got the usability to see their patients anyway and so forth. So hopefully we'll be able to get that level of info down to them to make their clinical decisions on prioritization. But thank you very much, Laura. That was really interesting presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. If we can whip to 2 more questions very quickly for a popular subject, Laura. Heather.
Hi, yes, mine was just a really quick question. You mentioned that you worked with clinical coding to produce a mapping table, and I imagine if you took that mapping table to any other provider in the trust in the country, they've probably done a similar sort of thing. I just wondered whether or not your table could be shared maybe on NHS Futures or whatever, so other people can just compare it and make sure that kind of like there's consistency. And if they haven't used it, they could perhaps use it as a springboard into adopting that themselves.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, because I suspect every trust has a slightly different catalogue of procedures, and that it would be interesting to see, yeah, how different trusts have mapped against the procedures. I mean, in Northwest London, we're slowly moving towards all using the same system. So in theory, that would mean that at some point in the distant future, Northwest London would all, be using the same base for all of our data. So it would be, really useful to see if we can get there.
Brilliant. And just one very quick one again from Wales. Jessica Pang is asking how we ensure people continue to use it properly and not start putting their own shortcuts. And that is a difficult one. I guess you're going to address that through your data quality monitoring, Laura, because that's kind of what I keep an eye on, because people are quite fond of popping someone up to a P2 just to make sure that that P3 keeps its place in the queue, because it's a bit more urgent than some of the other P3s. And yeah,
exactly.
So is that how you address that?
Yeah, so we've kind of used a number of different flags to pull out exactly that in our data quality sheet.
Yeah, it's a hard one to do. I think this is a subject we'll need to revisit again. Thank you so much. Again, I think I'd definitely like to drag you down here for for a regional meeting. But thank you very much. Right, so another show and tell, this time from Margaret Dockey. Margaret is from NHS Business Services Authority, and she's talking to us today about using data to inform patient care. So over to you, Margaret.
Okay then, right. So we'll start. Okay then, so hi everybody. I'm Margaret Dockey and I'm from the Business Services Authority. And it was said that my presentation today is about how we're using data to inform patient care. Now, I don't know if anybody knows about the Business Services Authority and who we are, but we are an arm's length body of the Department of Health and Social Care, and we deliver national services to help the NHS run efficiently. We manage healthcare information at scale and have a reputation for driving cost savings and efficiencies. And the NHS spends in the region of £70 billion annually through the NHS BSA services and platforms. And we've saved £1 billion for the NHS between 2015 and 2020. Our purpose is to be a catalyst for better health, and our data and insight adds value to the wider healthcare system. So today I'm going to talk to you about prescribing data which has been dispensed in a primary care setting. So we'll move to the next slide. What I'm going to do is start off by just sharing with you some headlines which you'll probably all be fairly familiar with, as they're often in the press. And for some people, these are quite startling headlines that'll keep them awake at night. So if they see things in the press like NHS must take action to avoid US-style opioid crisis, antidepressant prescriptions in England double in a decade. We need to reduce UK antimicrobial use in humans by 15% by 2024. The average number of medicines per head of population was 20 in 2016 compared with 13 in 2003. So data can deliver some powerful messages, but we also want to use the data to help reduce these figures and to stop these headlines being so prominent in the news. We all know that we need to reduce the number of medicines a patient takes. We need to play our role in reducing antibiotic resistance. We need to ensure the safer management of controlled drugs. And these, along with a number of other priorities, can sometimes be quite overwhelming. How do you know which of these challenges is the biggest issue for you in your area, and how can you change behaviour? And which groups of patients need the most urgent interventions, and how do you know if your interventions with patients are working? So that's just some food for thought. And I'll leave you with to think about that while I give you some background into the work we do in the Data and Insight team at the BSA and how we use data. Move to the next slide, please. Yes, so I'll start with the purpose of the Data and Insight team, which is to transform data into actionable insight, empowering people to make important decisions. So this slide just shows the structure of our team and the data, with data being at the heart of everything we do. But I'm not going to talk about the team, I'm going to talk about the data that we use. So for this presentation, the data we're working with is prescription data, which has been captured from NHS prescription forms, which has been prescribed and dispensed in a primary care setting. So historically, this data captured was primarily to make payments to community pharmacists for the drugs that they dispensed, and the data collected during this process was just a byproduct. And at that time, the reporting was basically around volume and cost. So we could report back to the NHS the cost of prescribing in different therapeutic areas such as diabetes, respiratory, cardiology, etc., and how they compared with their peers. And that really was as much as we could do with the data. However, this all changed back in 2015 when it became mandatory to print the patient's NHS number onto paper prescription forms. It was already contained in the electronic message but wasn't captured because the volumes at that time was very small. But once this information was available on paper forms, we realised how powerful our data would become if we captured the information and just what a difference it would make to our reporting, making it much more granular and richer in content. So the information we now collect from paper and electronic messages is the drug and appliance data, which is on all prescriptions prescribed and dispensed in the community, and the patient level data, which is the NHS number, the patient's age and the date of birth. In addition, we validate the patient level data against the personal demographic service data, which provides us with extra granularity of gender. So this has really become a big game changer for us, and it allows us to do so much more with the data and look at things in a completely different way than we did before. We can now look at the drugs individual patients are taking, and we can establish if certain patients are taking drugs X, Y, and Z, but maybe not taking drug A, B, and C, or other patients are taking drugs A, B, and C and not drugs X, Y, and Z. You know, so we're going to look at things in a completely different way, things we wouldn't have imagined possible a few years ago. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so now I've told you just how good our data is, how granular it is. I'll give you some examples of how we use the prescribing data. So for me, one of the main value of prescribing data is to support direct patient care and to improve patient safety and patient outcomes. And we have used our data to develop dashboards around clinical problematic areas where comparators have been developed which can influence and measure changes in behaviour. So examples of dashboards are around valproate prescribing in women of childbearing age where pregnancy can cause risk to the unborn baby. Polypharmacy, which is a term used for prescribing of multiple medicines to individual patients. Antimicrobial stewardship, where we're looking at reducing the amount of antibiotic prescribing. And the big one at the minute, which is opioid dependency. Our data is also used to support commissioning activities where we publish pharmacy activity data, antimicrobial quality premium data, and data to support NHS England commissioned services. We also provide data to other organisations who use it to develop their own insight. And an example of this is where we share data with Public Health England, who map prescribing data against patients on the cancer registry to establish whether there's any correlation between the drugs taken before and after diagnosis of cancer. We support research projects and provide data for insight into COVID-19 activities and also the monitoring of drugs in the supply chain to highlight potential shortages. But the data isn't just important for clinicians. There's also a financial interest too, and we support the Medicines Value Programme, where we provide a number of reports and dashboards which identify areas where savings can be made, such as in the prescribing of over-the-counter products, and where potential savings can be made by prescribing by generic drug name rather than branded drug name. And as well as all of this, future projects will look to provide insight into new data sets such as care home prescribing, and we're also looking to bring into our data warehouse the Ministry of Defence prescribing data. So if we'll move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I've given you some background into the type of work we do. I thought it'd be useful to share some specific examples with you to show what our data tells us. And an area of growing concern is the continual increase in the prescribing of addictive or dependency-forming medication. These include opioid medication, antidepressants, benzodiazepines. And we found that 1 in 11 patients who receive a prescription is prescribed one of these medicines. And from the period April 2017 to March 2018, there were approximately 149 million dependency-forming drug items dispensed at a cost of £1.2 billion. And that more recently, with the current situation, this will have increased somewhat. Go on to the next slide, please. Yep. So we can look at another case study in more detail where we're following a deep dive into the data, where we were looking at the prescribing of codeine tablets. We were able to uncover that one patient received just over 4,000 codeine tablets in a 6-month period. So this is over twice the maximum dose that would be expected for a patient during that period of time. An analysis showed that the analysis of the practices that the patient had visited showed they were registered at 2 different GP practices at 2 different addresses. And the GP practices were 60 miles apart and were in 2 different CCG areas. Further analysis showed that they received a regular prescription once a month at one practice, and the prescription contained 4 items, and they had a valid prepayment certificate which they used at that practice. But at the second practice, they were receiving multiple prescriptions per month, and they were paying for those as they were being dispensed. And they were also getting the prescriptions dispensed at multiple pharmacies. So this piece of analysis only focused on a certain patient habit and certain drugs, but it should give you an indication of just how powerful the data can be and what we can uncover by using our data.
I believe you were sent the links to the breakout rooms in your inboxes. Is it last night, Val, or early this morning? Last night, I think it was. So join us for one of 3 breakouts. Let me just see if I can grab what the titles are. Oh, here we go. They're coming up now. Machine learning, professionalism, and R is number 1. Because I can't see that's moved off the top of my screen. So yes, 3 to choose from. The links are in the chat. See you in one of the chat rooms. Grab yourself a quick cup of coffee and then join us in the chat rooms, and then we recommence at midday. Wow, thank you very much, guys.
Okay, well, we'll virtually call the room to order. Welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Alison Wilkinson. Anybody who doesn't know me, I'm the Finance Director for AphA and one of the few non-analysts in their virtual room. I was just reflecting to Ronnie what a great morning it's been. Even as a non-analyst, you know, the presentations have been really engaging and really helpful. So really interesting. And this is our last session before lunch today, and I've got the pleasure of introducing Ming Tang. So Ming is the Data and Analytics Officer for NHS England, Chief Data and Analytics Officer for NHS England and NHS Improvement. And I'm hoping, Ming, that your presentation will appear somewhere in a moment, but I will hand you over now to Ming, and welcome.
Thanks, Alison. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can, Ming. Thanks.
Does it say AphA?
Yeah.
Make it larger. Brilliant. Cool. So, is that all right? Can I start? So, as Alison said, I'm Ming Tang. I'm the Chief Data Analytics Officer for NHS England and Improvement. I'm delighted to speak at this conference. I thought part of what I wanted to do was just make this a bit more personal. So forgive me for wandering down memory lane and remembering how things started for me. For some reason, my slides won't move. It's a very good start. It might be that because I pulled the slides up that someone your side needs to operate them.
We're happy to move it, Ming. I don't know if you can see it. It's moved on my screen, so I've just moved to the next slide. So.
Well, that means I think everybody could move their own, but it's ideal.
Oh, it's okay.
I've just made it happen. So yes, Ming, if you want to call out.
No, I can do it. I can do it now. I found the thing on slides. Can you? So I thought I would break my life story into 3 bits and share a bit about myself. So starting off, as I've said, quite happy and humble beginnings. Born in Hong Kong, grew up in a very happy family, emigrated to England. My dad came over first when I was 7, and we had a family Chinese takeaways. This is quite common with Chinese families that emigrate from Hong Kong. I did my first degree at Aston in the School of Pharmacy and really enjoyed it. And I spent all my holidays working for Boots, a chemist, and really helped me understand retail, but not really, and working through with people. So I guess the reason for giving you that background is that I think it's made me quite grounded. And also, I always think that being brought up in a takeaway, doing your homework at the counter, means that you kind of see all sorts of people in life, and gives you kind of gave me for some reason more of an inner confidence in how to deal with disruptive people, like throwing out people that had had too much to drink, who were making a noise and disturbing other customers. So I guess there's a part of me that always goes back to those days, in terms of how I think about myself, and also how I kind of think about what's important in my life. So that last quote is actually, my family are quite happy to tell me that get over yourself, which is great. Started my first job as a graduate trainee for GlaxoSmithKline. So from pharmacy, I joined industry. I did 6 months actually at Leighton Hospital and Crewe, which was not, I would say, was one of the reasons why I never joined the NHS at that point. But I did a graduate training scheme with Glaxo, which really gave me huge opportunities working in manufacturing. I kind of visited all sites. The reason for the jet is that my first trip with Glaxo to the US was in the company jet to the R&D centre in Research Triangle in North Carolina. So I had a really good grounding, really good opportunities. And that's one of the things I always reflect is actually what makes your career. It's just isn't really the jobs that you go for, but the opportunities that you might have. And I think that's very pertinent to what I want to do for the data and analytics community. During Glaxo, I actually spent some time at Warwick Business School, did my MBA there, and then I joined what was Anderson Consulting, which then became Accenture. And again, it was very much reacting to opportunities. I was asked to join as a strategy consultant, worked in supply chain, helping people design supply chain strategies based on my operational background from Glaxo. And then I was asked to go and help them set up the supply chain practice in Sydney. So I went over to Australia, which was originally for 2 years. We sold, I think in my first week, we sold into Fonterra, which is the New Zealand map on the right-hand side. Fonterra were the global dairy company in New Zealand at the time when I was quoting. It was the New Zealand Dairy Board, and it was, I always remember, it was 8% of their GDP, so a really huge contributor to New Zealand's GDP. And from there, really, again, it was a strategy piece of work for 8 weeks, and I stayed with that client for 5 years. They were my anchor client in Southeast Asia. From doing all of that, you know, I still believe that you need to maintain your life and have fun. I love skiing. I have hens, that I rescue hens that I look after. And really, I think having a broader aspect of life than just work is really important to me as well.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt for a second? We can't, if slides aren't moving on, we can move them on ourselves. Okay. We need to know when to move them on. So when you were talking initially about happy and humble beginnings, I was looking at 3 blank bits. And then when I click it again, I can see the next bit.
Did you want to just click to the last piece? There should be 3 transitions.
Okay, so then when you move on to the next slide, could you let the meeting know, and then we can all individually do that, and hopefully that's okay for everybody in the meeting as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Apologies.
Thanks, Sam.
And then I guess why did I join the NHS? From working quite long hours, I returned from Australia back to the UK, spent a couple more years in Accenture in the UK, but I was doing a lot more travelling, and for personal reasons, and also because I was a bit tired of selling outsourcing, a bit tired of doing very similar projects for clients, and travelling a lot back and forth to Southeast Asia still. I joined the NHS in the West Midlands, and it was right about the time pre-CSUs. We had really good support for and teams to do the commissioning support services in the West Midlands. And then the CSU kind of change came, and also at the same time, the Health and Social Care Act. And I don't know if you guys remember, but the 2012 Health and Social Care Act basically was all about data protection. And I kind of got pulled into the national team at that point to support really getting the national infrastructure together, making sure that CSUs and also kind of CCGs actually had access to the data that they needed, because all of a sudden we went from personal identifiable data to no data at all, because we didn't have the legal basis for it. So that was quite a traumatic time. My reflection of that is actually life is short. Don't take yourself too seriously. And one of the things I was playing around with that gave me great delight was actually looking at little piglets. And we actually bought a house around about this time with some land where I was actually going to try and get some pigs to rear. So that's a side of me that not many people know, but it's something I hold quite dear, and I still want to do that at some point in my life. With all those changes, we also created the ability to transfer data, and that's when we set up the desk rows and worked quite closely with NHS Digital and the CSUs. And we had, as part of that kind of transfer, we set up the National Commissioning Data Repository, which is now really the national data source for all the SUS data that we have. We also had an opportunity while Matthew Swindells was with us to create a single version of truth, and we initially did that with our partners in Cerner and now CSU, and we built a product called Viewpoint. So that was quite a journey. And then I guess when coronavirus started and COVID-19 started hitting the ground, I was asked to really set up a data store and then work with NHSX very clearly to set up the data platforms. And really the journey from them, I think most of you have contributed to that journey, and it's been fantastic, I think, for data and analytics. And what I want to talk to you a bit more about today is how we can continue to build the staff and resourcing for that. As part of that, one of the really good things and the legacies from the COVID data store and platform and COVID-19 is AnalystX, and we want to continue to build that. I think part of my philosophy at this time is just for people to remain curious and keep learning. I always, every year, invest in myself and try and learn a new skill. And during this time, I was doing lots of bread making and pizzas. We bought a pizza oven, and I think this year I'm doing some more upholstery. So trying to learn a new skill just to make sure your mind's open and that you're not always focused on work-related activities, very important to me. So next slide. So I wanted to now move on to the value of health and care analysts. Kind of the pandemic has shone a light on, the potential of analysts. I think this has been a really valuable change and something that we really want to maintain. And over the last year, I would, really grateful for all the work that the analytical community has done, how you're mobilized to provide quick analysis and work together really collaboratively, so that we had a common goal and that we were solving it together. That's the energy and also the collaboration I want to maintain. And what's really been beneficial of that is we now have lots of executives who really understand the importance of data analytics and are really keen for me as the head of profession to start encouraging more talent for the future. And I'll go through some of the things that we're trying to do. So part of this journey is to make sure that we make the most of the talent that we have, continue to develop and grow our analysts. And, at the moment, we think there's about 10,000 analysts in the NHS, and we really want to make the most of that talent. So just wanted to go through a bit of my role. Some of this is, the post of a Chief Data and Analytics Officer was created so that I could act as the system-wide leadership for data analytics and really drive the professionalism of all staff. So some of the things that we're working with AphA on is to really start looking at the competencies of that. I think as an NHS, we have multiple products, data analysis that quite often compete with each other. And I think what we found during COVID was actually being more open and sharing and collaborating, pinching with pride It's like how I like to think about it. You know, if someone's done some really good stuff, can we just reuse it rather than starting from scratch? And that way we need to make sure that we're connecting the workforce, and then we're upskilling and providing ongoing development for all the analysts. We also have a lot of analysts that are fairly isolated or working in silos, not through their own choice necessarily, but quite often the way that the organisation structures do not permit kind of collaboration, and we don't always have the right tools or the right data to help us do that. So part of what I'm hoping to close the gap on is making sure that there is more of a level playing field for all analysts and data people in the NHS. Next slide. So in our COVID response, I mentioned it earlier on, we, Suki and Polly and lots of you set up the Analyst X platform as part of Future NHS, and we now have 15,000 members that are from all over the country. And this to me really shows the power of bringing you all together. And the beauty of the Analyst X work is that it's beyond organisation boundaries and allows us to shift to a more collaborative and open way of working. And what I want to do is make sure we build upon this to make it a powerhouse for all the types of analysis that we need to do together. And my vision is that we federate not just the data and analytics platforms, but we also federate the analysts that are using those tools to join together to solve common problems. Some of our strategic partners have been really important on this journey, and I just wanted to recognise those. They've been really supportive in their time, their resources, their people, and I think together we've actually made quite a lot of, we've had a lot of benefit of their support as well. So just wanted to recognise our partners. So one of the key aspirations I have is really to make sure that we have on the Analyst X platform reliable data, reliable information, has a resource pool, so that it becomes a go-to place for analysts. It's owned by you as members, and everybody contributes. It's open, it's autonomous. I don't think it needs to have a hierarchy in there. I would like it to be very much led by the members. It needs to be a place where you go also to understand where the education products are and make sure that we better understand the needs of members, and really providing almost a connectivity and the connective tissue between the system and us understanding what the demand for analytical talent is. So if you think about what we've got at the moment, we're really at the first post of that, the reliability of a go-to place. As members of Analyst X, you're all driving the content, and there is quite a lot of sharing and educational stuff. What I want to do going forward is to kind of more formalise that and create a mechanism for better understanding the skill set needs and also supply and demand. Next slide.